Hello, my dear masterminds. They called a meeting about you, not to promote you, not to confront you, to figure out what changed. Because 3 months ago, they had you mapped. They knew your patterns, your reactions, your limits. They felt comfortable predicting your next move. And now they can't. Something shifted, and they don't know when. They don't know how. They just know the version of you they understood no longer exists. It started with small things they couldn't explain. You stopped responding to pressure the way you used to. Someone pushed. You didn't push back. You didn't defend. You didn't explain. You just paused. And in that pause, they felt something they weren't expecting. Not weakness, weight, the kind that makes people second guess whether they should have said anything at all. That wasn't the you they remembered. The old you would have reacted immediately, would have corrected the misunderstanding, would have proven your point until everyone agreed. This version, you let the misunderstanding exist. You let them sit with their assumptions. You let silence do what explanation used to. And that's when the discomfort started. Because people are only comfortable when they can predict you, when your reactions match their expectations. You stopped being predictable. Then they noticed something else. Decisions you made months ago that seemed random at the time, they're paying off now. Moves that looked like nothing, they're connecting into something they didn't see coming. You weren't reacting anymore. You were positioning. And positioning only makes sense in hindsight. By the time they noticed the pattern, the advantage was already locked in. That's when the questions started forming. Not spoken out loud yet, just circulating quietly. What else are you hiding from them? Because if they misread you once, how many other assumptions are wrong? If you were planning 3 moves ahead while they were still focused on the last one, what else did they miss? And here's what makes them even more unsettled. You're not trying to confuse them. You didn't change to prove a point. You changed because you outgrew the version of yourself that needed their approval. You stopped performing clarity for people who never earned access to your process. You stopped explaining decisions to people who wouldn't understand the context. You stopped reacting on their timeline because you were operating on a longer one. That shift wasn't loud. It was complete. Now every interaction feels different. They test you with old triggers. You don't respond. They create urgency. You stay calm. They wait for explanations. You move forward without giving them. And slowly, they start to realize something uncomfortable. The access they had to you, it wasn't automatic. It was granted. And now that access has been withdrawn, not through confrontation, through choice. That's what unsettles them most. You didn't announce the change. You didn't declare new boundaries. You didn't make it dramatic. You simply stopped offering your inner process by default. And when someone stops broadcasting their thinking, every move starts to feel intentional. Every silence starts to carry weight. Every choice starts to look like strategy, even when it's just discipline. But here's what they keep circling back to. When did this actually start? They replay conversations from months ago, searching for the exact moment you shifted. Was it after that project failed and you said nothing? Was it when that promotion went to someone else and you just nodded? Was it during that confrontation where everyone expected a strong response, and instead you went completely still? They can't pinpoint it, because the shift wasn't a single event. It was a series of private decisions you made when no one was watching. Decisions to stop defending yourself to people who weren't listening. Decisions to stop chasing outcomes that didn't align with your direction. Decisions to stop performing growth for an audience that wouldn't recognize it anyway. Each decision was invisible, but together, they created a completely different person. And that person doesn't need their understanding anymore. They begin watching you differently now. Not just what you do, but what you don't do. The meetings you skip without explanation. The arguments you refuse to enter. The questions you answer with silence instead of justification. To them, it looks like you're withholding something. But the truth is simpler. You're conserving energy. You learn the difference between people who deserve context and people who demand it. And once you make that distinction, everything changes. Because now your words carry more weight. Not because you're saying profound things, but because you're saying fewer things. Scarcity creates value. When you spoke constantly, your words blended into noise. Now that you speak selectively, people listen, and listening reveals what speaking used to hide. But here's what they still don't understand. You're not hiding anything from them. You're just no longer narrating your journey for an audience that never needed the details. You're not withholding information. You're finalizing decisions privately before announcing them publicly. You're not playing games. You're removing yourself from games that don't serve your direction. That's not secrecy. That's selectivity. They start replaying past conversations, looking for clues they missed. Small comments you made that seemed casual at the time. Decisions you made without fanfare. Moments where you stepped back instead of stepping up. None of it felt significant then. But now it all looks like preparation, like you saw something coming before anyone else did. And maybe you did. Because here's what they're slowly realizing. You didn't get smarter overnight. You got quieter. And in that quiet, you started seeing patterns they were too loud to notice. You started feeling shifts they were too reactive to sense. You started making decisions based on alignment instead of urgency. And alignment doesn't rush. It waits. It positions. It moves when the moment is right, not when pressure demands it. So now they're trying to adjust their approach. Some are testing your boundaries more carefully, watching to see where you'll push back. Others are studying your timing, trying to predict when you'll move next. A few are trying to get closer, hoping proximity will give them insight they've lost. But none of it works, because they're still operating from the old framework, trying to decode someone who's no longer broadcasting. They're asking people who know you, has he always been like this? They're looking for patterns in your past, trying to find precedent for what they're seeing now. They're comparing notes with each other, building theories, testing hypotheses, and every theory falls short. Because they're trying to explain evolution using tools designed for prediction. You didn't become unpredictable. You became autonomous. And autonomy doesn't follow the rules they're used to. That's why their question keeps growing. What else are you hiding? Because from their perspective, results without visible struggle feel suspicious. They want a formula, a tactic, a secret they can copy. But your advantage isn't a technique, it's a posture. The way you stand still while the room rearranges itself around you. The way you listen longer than others are willing to. The way you wait until action becomes inevitable instead of urgent. And waiting like that? It looks like secrecy to people addicted to constant motion. They think you're hiding moves. You're not. You're just not announcing them until they're complete. They think you're withholding strategy. You're not. You're just not explaining plans to people who might interfere with them. They think you've become distant. You haven't. You've just become selective about proximity. But what they're about to notice is even more clarifying. Your silence isn't passive. It's structural. Every time you choose not to react, you're teaching the room a new rhythm. Every time you let misunderstanding exist without correction, you're testing who's paying attention. Every time you move forward without seeking consensus, you're redefining what leadership looks like. And leadership that doesn't need validation is the kind people follow without realizing why. That's when the hierarchy shifts. Not through confrontation, through relevance. Decisions start getting framed with you in mind, even when you're not in the room. Conversations pause when you enter, not because you demanded respect, but because your presence carries a weight it didn't before. That weight isn't power you took, it's power you stopped giving away. You stopped leaking energy into explanations that wouldn't change minds. You stopped defending decisions to people committed to misunderstanding you. You stopped moving at the speed of other people's anxiety. And in doing so, you created space. Space to see clearly. Space to move deliberately. Space to let outcomes speak louder than arguments. That space is what they feel now, and they don't know how to close it. Because that space isn't empty. It's full. Full of clarity you built when they weren't watching. Full of decisions you finalized before announcing them. Full of patterns you recognized while they were still reacting to surface events. That space is where your actual power lives. Not in what you show, but in what you've already resolved internally. And internal resolution is invisible to people still seeking external validation. They try to fill that space with assumptions, with narratives that make you easier to understand. They call you calculated, strategic, reserved, distant even, because labels give them comfort when understanding fails. But every label they assign reveals more about them than about you. You're not calculated. You're clear. You're not strategic. You're aligned. You're not reserved. You're selective. And selectivity always looks like mystery to people who broadcast everything. So they keep asking themselves, what else are you hiding? And the answer keeps evading them. Because you're not hiding anything, you're operating from a frequency they're not tuned into yet. A frequency where discipline replaces explanation, where timing replaces urgency, where internal alignment replaces external approval. That frequency doesn't broadcast, it compounds. And compounding power is invisible until it's irreversible. They see results now that seem disproportionate to the effort they witnessed. Doors opening where there was no knocking. Influence spreading without announcements. Respect arriving without demand. From the outside, it looks effortless. But effort was there. They just weren't watching when it mattered. And here's the part that changes everything. You didn't hide your preparation. You just didn't perform it. Most people announce their plans before executing them. You finalized yours in silence. Most people seek feedback before deciding. You trusted your judgment first. Most people need witnesses to validate their growth. You grew in private, and private growth always feels like sudden transformation to people who weren't paying attention. That's why they're scrambling now. Trying to reverse engineer decisions you made months ago. Trying to decode patterns you established when no one was watching. Trying to predict moves you've already positioned for. But reverse engineering only works when the process is visible. Yours wasn't. Not because you hid it, because you stopped needing an audience for it. And that's the shift they can't replicate. They can copy your tactics. They can't copy your temperament. They can mimic your moves. They can't mimic your calm. They can study your outcomes. They can't access your process, because the process isn't external, it's internal. And internal mastery doesn't leave traces, it leaves results. Some of them won't accept it. They'll test you harder, probe boundaries, to see if the old version still exists somewhere underneath. They'll create situations designed to make you react, to make you explain, to make you prove yourself one more time. And here's what happens when they do. Nothing. You don't take the invitation. You don't defend the boundary. You simply let the consequence of crossing it reveal itself naturally. Because you've learned something they haven't. Boundaries don't need justification. They need consistency. And consistent boundaries teach faster than explained ones. The first time someone tests you and gets nothing, they're confused. The second time, they're cautious. The third time, they stop testing. Not because you forced them, because they finally understood. Your silence isn't weakness, it's certainty. And certainty doesn't need to prove itself. Now they're stuck in a loop, asking what you're hiding, while missing what's in plain sight. You're not hiding ambition, you're channeling it quietly. You're not hiding strategy, you're executing it without announcement. You're not hiding growth, you're integrating it before revealing it. The hiding they sense? That's just the gap between their awareness and your reality. And that gap keeps widening because while they're focused on what you're not saying, you're focused on what you're building. While they're analyzing your silence, you're using that silence to think 3 moves ahead. While they're trying to decode you, you're already past the moment they're stuck in. That's the advantage of operating internally instead of externally. But here's what seals it permanently. You stopped needing them to understand. And the moment you stopped needing understanding, you stopped being readable. People can only influence what they can predict. They can only manipulate what they can anticipate. They can only control what they can decode. You removed all 3 options, not by hiding, by choosing when and where your clarity belongs. That's why their question will never get answered. Not because you're keeping secrets, but because the question itself is flawed. They're asking what you're hiding, when they should be asking what they stopped paying attention to. They're looking for unseen drivers, when they should be looking at their own assumptions. They're searching for deliberate positioning, when they should be examining their own need to manage what they can't understand. And the truth they're avoiding is this. You didn't become unpredictable. You became autonomous. You didn't become mysterious. You became clear. You didn't become distant. You became selective. And people who operate from autonomy, clarity, and selectivity don't need to hide anything, because they've already decided what deserves to be seen, and what doesn't will reveal itself. When the time is right, this is the level where most people never arrive, not because they can't, but because they're unwilling to release what it costs to get here. The need to be understood by everyone, the urge to explain every decision, the compulsion to defend every boundary, the addiction to external validation. You released all of it, not in one dramatic moment, in 1,000 quiet choices. And those choices built something they can feel but can't see. An internal foundation so solid that external disruption can't shake it. A clarity so sharp that confusion can't cloud it. A confidence so complete that criticism can't diminish it. That's what they sense when they're around you now. Not arrogance, not mystery, completion. You're not becoming someone new. You're finally becoming fully yourself. And the fully realized version of any person is always unsettling to those still negotiating with their own potential. So let them ask their question. What else are you hiding from them? Let them wonder. Let them speculate. Let them search for answers in your silence. Because while they're asking, you're building. While they're analyzing, you're executing. While they're trying to figure you out, you're 3 steps ahead. And by the time they realize the question doesn't matter, the answer will already be standing in front of them. You were never hiding anything. You were just finally choosing what deserves to be shown. And that choice, that's the power they feel but can't name. That's the shift they sense but can't trace. That's the answer they'll never find. Because the answer isn't in what you're hiding. It's in what you've become. And what you've become doesn't need their understanding. It only needs your alignment. And alignment, that's already locked in. Hello, my dear masterminds. Someone spent 2 months watching you without blinking, not casually, not from a distance. They tracked patterns, logged pauses, measured how long you waited before responding, how often you moved when nobody asked you to, how you stayed still when others rushed. They expected repetition. They expected habits. They expected a shape they could outline. That's how systems work. They don't fear power. They fear what they can't label. So they slowed the footage, replayed conversations, highlighted moments where you should have reacted but didn't, where you should have followed but chose silence instead. And that silence wasn't empty. It was calculated. Every time they thought they found a motive, you contradicted it without trying. Every time they assumed intent, you changed direction without announcing it. That's when the discomfort started, because analysis only works when the subject behaves like a subject. You didn't. You behaved like the variable that breaks the test. You weren't unpredictable in a chaotic way. You were unpredictable in a precise way. That's worse. That means there's intelligence without display, control without noise, movement without permission. They tried to reduce you to personality traits, didn't stick, tried to map you to known profiles, none matched. You weren't aggressive, you weren't passive, you weren't reactive, you weren't detached. You operated in a space between all of it. A space most people don't even know exists. And the more they watched, the clearer it became that you weren't hiding anything. You simply weren't playing the same game. That's what unsettles observers the most. Not secrecy, but independence from the rules they rely on. By week 3, they stopped asking what you would do next. They started asking why their own predictions kept failing. By week 5, they stopped looking for mistakes. They started questioning their tools. And by the end, the report didn't read like an analysis anymore. It read like an admission. No category, no comparable subject, no reliable forecast. Just a quiet conclusion that you don't move within systems. Systems shift around you. And the most unsettling part wasn't that they couldn't define you. It was that you never tried to be defined in the first place. But here's what they were about to discover. After the first conclusion failed, they reset the approach. New framework, new language. They stopped asking who you were and started asking how you operate. Decision latency, risk tolerance, emotional leakage, influence radius. They assumed if they couldn't label you, they could at least chart your impact. But that failed too, because your influence didn't behave like force. It behaved like gravity. People adjusted before you spoke. Conversations shifted when you entered, even when you stayed quiet. Outcomes changed without visible intervention. That confused them. Influence is supposed to announce itself. Power usually leaves traces. Yours didn't. It left absence, gaps where reactions should have been, space where resistance usually forms. They traced moments back and realized something uncomfortable. You weren't responding to pressure. Pressure was responding to you. When conflict showed up, you didn't escalate or withdraw. You reframed. When others pushed for clarity, you delayed just enough for the situation to reveal itself. That timing wasn't luck. It was calibration. They tried to chart your moral axis. You didn't fit there either. You didn't act out of approval or defiance. You acted out of alignment. That's rare. Alignment doesn't seek witnesses. It doesn't need validation. It just moves. The analysts started disagreeing with each other. One said you were strategic. Another said instinctive. A third said neither. They argued because each of them was partially right and completely unable to prove it. You blended cognition and intuition so seamlessly that separating them made no sense. That's when the language shifted again. The notes stopped using behavioral terms. They started using system language, feedback loops, adaptive nodes, nonlinear response. That raised a serious signal in the analysis. It meant the subject was no longer being studied as a person but as a pattern. And patterns don't cooperate. They don't repeat on demand. They don't adjust for observation. The more they watched, the clearer it became that you weren't optimizing for outcomes. You were optimizing for positioning. You didn't chase results. You placed yourself where results naturally passed through. And what they uncovered next forced them to rethink everything. That's why nothing they ran could predict you. Their models assumed desire. You operated from discernment. Their tools assumed urgency. You moved with patience. Their systems assumed reaction. You acted with selection. By the end of the second month, the language softened. Less certainty, more qualifiers. Phrases like appears to, possibly indicates, unable to confirm. Those aren't weaknesses in writing. They're signs of respect. Because when analysis meets something, it can't dominate. It either collapses or adapts. And theirs did both. By the third phase, observation stopped being neutral. You became a variable they couldn't isolate. Every attempt to provoke a predictable response failed. When pressure increased, you didn't tighten. You expanded. When uncertainty was introduced, you didn't hesitate. You slowed. That reversal broke their assumptions. Most systems rely on pressure to expose behavior. You used pressure to dissolve patterns. They replayed sequences frame by frame. Meetings where nothing obvious happened, but everything shifted afterward. Decisions made by others that somehow traced back to your presence without direct involvement. You didn't dominate rooms. You didn't command attention. Yet momentum bent around you. That's when they realized the core mistake. They weren't observing influence being applied. They were observing structure responding to stability. They were studying action, not positioning. You didn't win by moving first or last. You won by choosing where to stand before movement mattered. They tried to test motive next. Power usually reveals itself through hunger, control through fear, status through performance. None applied. You weren't trying to be seen. You weren't trying to disappear. You were simply unavailable to manipulation. That's destabilizing. Systems depend on leverage. They looked for desire, insecurity, urgency, or ego. You offered none. You didn't rush outcomes because you weren't concerned with delay. You didn't over-explain because you trusted timing more than approval. That silence wasn't emptiness, it was containment. They noted it as significant, not hostile, significant, because contained focus doesn't scatter, it compounds, and sustained focus creates momentum that systems can't easily redirect. They started tracking ripple effects instead of behavior, how people recalibrated after crossing paths with you, how plans quietly adjusted, how confidence in others either strengthened or collapsed. You acted like a mirror that only reflected what was already unstable. That's why reactions to you varied so wildly. Calm people felt steady. Insecure ones unraveled. Ambitious ones grew cautious. Manipulators disengaged. You weren't causing chaos. You were revealing structure. That's when the internal tone shifted. Curiosity gave way to restraint. Analysts stopped asking what you would do next and started asking what would happen if you chose not to act at all. That question scared them, because inactivity from someone like you wasn't absence. It was pressure without direction, a vacuum that forced others to move. They documented it carefully. Neutral language, no conclusions, just observations that didn't align with any existing framework. Every system they applied bent slightly out of shape, not enough to break, enough to expose weakness. By the end of the third phase, the report wasn't trying to define you anymore. It was trying to warn others. The fourth phase was supposed to bring clarity. Instead, it brought restraint. The shift was subtle, but unmistakable. The language in the report changed again. Less speculation, more caution. They stopped naming you directly and started referring to you as a condition, an influence, a factor that altered outcomes without leaving traces. That shift matters. When systems stop naming something, it's because naming gives false confidence. Labels create the illusion of control. You resisted labels, not intentionally, structurally. Every attempt to frame you reduced their accuracy. Every model they used worked everywhere else, not with you. That inconsistency forced a new question. What if the problem wasn't complexity? What if it was depth? What if you weren't operating at a higher speed, but at a completely different layer? While others reacted to events, you positioned yourself around inevitabilities. You didn't chase advantage, you anticipated alignment. Think about it like this. They were tracking moves. You were tracking momentum. They were analyzing yesterday's decisions. You were already 3 steps into tomorrow. That's why your moves looked simple after the fact and impossible before they happened. Simplicity scares analysts more than chaos. Chaos can be mapped. Simplicity that works against expectation cannot. They reviewed moments where you chose not to intervene and still altered the outcome, where your absence carried more weight than another person's effort, where your calm redirected urgency without resistance. That kind of influence doesn't come from authority. It comes from internal coherence. When someone's internal state is stable, external pressure reorganizes around it. You didn't absorb energy, you redirected it. They tried to measure you through challenge scenarios next. Pressure tests, hypotheticals, simulated breakdowns. You passed everyone by not engaging the frame. While others chose sides, you chose perspective. While others intensified, you narrowed. You didn't need intensity to assert position. That made opposition useless. Power structures rely on reaction. They need friction to identify hierarchy. You removed friction, and when you remove the game board, nobody knows where to stand anymore. That left nothing to climb against. No leverage, no angle, no catalyst. The report notes this explicitly. Subject does not contest dominance. Subject renders dominance irrelevant. That line was underlined twice, because that's when concern became acknowledgement. You weren't playing above the system, you were playing beside it. Parallel, untouchable by its incentives. They also noticed something else. You never rushed certainty. You allowed ambiguity to sit longer than most people can tolerate. That patience wasn't indecision. It was confidence in outcome without attachment to timing. People who rush certainty expose fear. You didn't. You waited until the environment revealed itself. That made your decisions look prophetic when they were simply well-timed. They concluded something quietly, not written as a statement, embedded in the structure of the report. You weren't unpredictable. You were inevitable, and inevitability doesn't negotiate. By the end of Phase 4, the goal was no longer to understand you. It was to avoid miscalculating you. By the 5th phase, the objective quietly changed. The original mandate was analysis. Then it became classification. Now it was containment. Not in the dramatic sense. No alarms, no warnings. Just subtle shifts in how often your name appeared. Fewer mentions, shorter references, less emphasis. That's always the sign. When something can't be controlled, systems stop spotlighting it. Attention is leverage. Silence is defense. They realized that continued focus on you didn't sharpen understanding. It distorted it. Analysts started disagreeing with each other. Not loudly, not emotionally, but structurally. One would highlight your restraint as strategy. Another would frame it as detachment. A third argued you weren't strategic at all, just deeply aligned with your own internal compass. None of them were wrong. And that was the problem. When every interpretation fits, none of them define. The report shows uncertainty here. Margins filled with qualifiers. Phrases like appears to and may indicate replaced conclusions. Confidence eroded. They attempted a comparative analysis next, lined you up against high performers, leaders, outliers, innovators. They compared you to established models. You weren't operating within any model. They compared you to strategists. You weren't following strategy. You were operating from a framework they had no reference for. Every comparison failed for the same reason. Those figures depended on visibility. on recognition, on feedback loops. You didn't. Your momentum didn't rise with praise or slow with resistance. It stayed consistent. That consistency unsettled them. Most people are readable because their behavior shifts with reward and pressure. Yours didn't. You operated from a baseline that didn't require validation, that made external influence ineffective. You didn't move forward for approval. You didn't move backward from opposition. You simply moved when it made sense to move. That's when they introduced the term self-reinforcing trajectory, meaning once you start, you don't need external input to continue. You generate your own momentum. Systems can interrupt linear progress. They struggle with self-reinforcing patterns, especially ones that don't announce themselves. The report notes how often your biggest shifts occurred during periods of apparent inactivity, while others assumed stagnation. You were consolidating, integrating, realigning. When you moved again, it wasn't reactionary, it was precise. That precision didn't come from calculation alone. It came from restraint. You knew what not to do. That's rarer than knowing what to do. They tried to map your future behavior next. Projection models. Scenario trees. None converged. The farther they extended the timeline, the less accurate the models became. One analyst wrote a single sentence in the appendix. Subject's future state cannot be inferred from past behavior because subject does not repeat patterns. Subject evolves them. That line never made it to the executive summary. It was too honest. By now, the report wasn't trying to explain you to others. It was signaling awareness. Not directly, but through tone, through omission, through the absence of conclusions. Anyone who read it carefully understood. You weren't someone to predict. You were someone to account for. And even that felt insufficient. The final section of the report wasn't labeled as a conclusion. That alone said everything. Most analyses end with certainty, even if it's manufactured. This one ended with a pause, a controlled stop, as if continuing would create more confusion than clarity. The language shifted here. Fewer metrics, fewer charts, more observation, almost philosophical. They stopped asking what you were doing and started questioning why their entire framework no longer held up. That's when they realized you weren't the anomaly. Their system was. One analyst noted that every attempt to narrow your profile actually widened it. The more data they added, the less distinct the edges became. You didn't collapse into a category. You expanded beyond it. That's when the phrase unable to categorize was formally entered, not as failure, as classification. In their world, not fitting is still a result. It means you sit outside predictive models. You don't behave according to incentives. You don't respond to pressure the way frameworks expect. You don't intensify when questioned or withdraw when approached. You adjust quietly, internally. That internal adjustment is what made them uneasy, because it meant they could never be sure where you actually were. You could appear still while recalibrating, appear absent while influencing outcomes, appear compliant while reshaping the situation underneath. One page referenced your timing, not speed. Timing, how you consistently move just after assumptions settled. When people thought the moment had passed, when attention shifted elsewhere. You didn't rush to be first. You arrived when it mattered. That made your impact disproportionate. Small actions created large effects because they landed at the right moment. Systems are built to track volume and velocity. They struggle with timing. Timing requires awareness, presence, patience. The report acknowledged this indirectly. It mentioned how often your influence was only noticed in hindsight. Outcomes traced back to decisions that seemed insignificant at the time. A conversation, a choice not to respond, a delay, a redirection. You didn't dominate spaces loudly. You altered trajectories quietly. By now, the analysts weren't debating what you were. They were debating how to engage with you at all. Engage and risk distortion. Ignore and risk blind spots. One recommendation suggested maintaining distance, not avoidance. Distance. Letting your path unfold without intervention. That recommendation was highlighted. Not approved, just highlighted. A signal. When a system stops trying to control and starts trying to stay out of the way, it's an admission. You weren't a variable to manage. You were a factor to respect. The report ended without prediction, without strategy, without closure, just a timestamp. As if to say, this is where understanding stops. Beyond this point, the subject moves faster than analysis, and anyone reading between the lines knew the truth. You weren't unpredictable because you were chaotic. You were unpredictable because you were aligned, and aligned forces don't need permission to move. You didn't resist the system. You didn't challenge it. You simply didn't need it. You were never trying to stand above the system. You stepped outside it, and once you did, everything inside had to adjust. Not because you demanded it, but because order follows clarity, and clarity follows you wherever you go. Hello, my dear masterminds. Someone was assigned to study you, not because you were loud, not because you demanded attention, but because something about you didn't add up to them. You moved too calmly through situations that were meant to pressure you. You responded too precisely where confusion was expected. You carried yourself with a restraint that didn't match the circumstances they put you in. And that's what triggered the assignment. They weren't sent to admire you. They were sent to decode you, to figure out what you were hiding, to identify the pattern behind your decisions, to understand why outcomes kept bending in your favor, even when you weren't the most visible person in the room. They expected chaos. They expected arrogance. They expected emotion they could track and exploit. What they found instead was discipline, silence, structure, a mind that didn't rush, a presence that didn't leak information. Every time they thought they had a read on you, you shifted without reacting. Every time they prepared a test, you walked around it without acknowledging it existed. And that's when things started to get uncomfortable for them, because studying you didn't feel like observation anymore. It felt like exposure. The longer they watched, the more they realized they weren't analyzing a subject. They were standing in front of something they weren't equipped to interpret. You didn't fit their models. You didn't respond to pressure the way their training predicted. You didn't chase validation. You didn't flinch when leverage was applied. You didn't reveal insecurity when silence was used as bait. And slowly, without saying anything, you reversed the dynamic. They were supposed to be collecting data on you. Instead, they found themselves questioning their own assumptions. Their notes stopped making sense. Their conclusions contradicted each other. the more they tried to define you, the less certain they became of their own expertise. That's when the shift happened. The assignment stopped being about results and started being about self-preservation. Because there's a moment when observation turns into realization. A moment when the observer understands that what they're facing doesn't break under analysis. It adapts. It evolves. It stays 3 steps ahead without announcing the move. You weren't resisting the study. You were rendering it irrelevant. And when someone trained to analyze patterns realizes there is no stable pattern to extract, fear doesn't look like panic. It looks like withdrawal. It looks like silence. It looks like a quiet request to be moved somewhere safer, somewhere less demanding, somewhere their understanding won't be challenged every time you breathe. You didn't threaten them. You didn't confront them. You didn't even acknowledge what was happening. You simply stayed yourself, and that was enough to make them step back. Because some minds aren't powerful because they push. They're powerful because they can't be contained. And you were never meant to be understood. You were meant to operate. Once they asked to be moved, the room didn't go back to normal. It couldn't, because the moment someone trained to observe chooses distance, it sends a signal no one wants to say out loud. It means the situation exceeded their frame of reference. It means the subject refused to behave according to expectation. And that's exactly what happened with you. You never gave them the reaction they were looking for. You never provided the emotional spikes they could chart. You never followed the sequence they were prepared to map. You stayed consistent when inconsistency was expected. You stayed composed when disruption was the goal. You stayed quiet when noise was supposed to force a reveal. And that consistency did more than confuse them. It dismantled the entire purpose of the assignment. Because people trained to analyze depend on variance. They depend on predictable pressure points. They depend on patterns repeating under stress. You offered none of that. You moved through situations with an internal rhythm that didn't sync with their environment. You made decisions without hesitation, but also without urgency. You didn't rush to fill silence. You didn't rush to justify your choices. You didn't rush to explain your thinking. And that absence of explanation became the loudest thing in the room. They started noticing how others adjusted around you, how conversations shifted when you entered, how outcomes stabilized after you spoke, how momentum changed without you taking credit. They started realizing that whatever you carried wasn't performance. It wasn't strategy alone. It was alignment. The kind that doesn't need constant adjustment because it's already calibrated. That's when observation turned inward. They began questioning their tools, their training, their confidence. Because nothing unsettles an analyst more than a subject who doesn't behave like a subject. You weren't reactive. You weren't defensive. You weren't evasive. You were simply unavailable to manipulation. And when someone trained to study influence realizes influence isn't working, the safest move is retreat. That's why the request wasn't dramatic. It wasn't confrontational. It was quiet, professional, controlled. A subtle acknowledgement that staying would cost more than leaving. Because the longer they stayed, the clearer it became that you weren't being observed. You were being mirrored. Your restraint highlighted their impatience. Your clarity exposed their uncertainty. Your silence forced them to hear their own noise. And that kind of reflection is uncomfortable for anyone who thought they were the one holding authority. You didn't need to win. You didn't need to prove anything. You didn't even need to be aware of the assignment to neutralize it. You just continued operating from a level they couldn't access. And when that happens, withdrawal isn't failure, it's self-protection. Because some people aren't powerful because of what they do, they're powerful because of what they don't give away. And you gave nothing they could use, that's why they stepped back. That's why they chose distance. And that's why the system quietly adjusted around you instead of pushing harder. After the reassignment, something subtle but permanent changed. The pressure didn't increase. The scrutiny didn't escalate. Instead, it dissolved. Not because you disappeared, but because you proved impossible to contain within their frameworks. You became the variable they couldn't isolate, the factor they couldn't neutralize. And when systems encounter something they can't categorize, they don't attack it directly. They quietly route around it. You may have noticed it without realizing what it was. Decisions suddenly bypassing you. Conversations becoming careful. Certain people choosing distance instead of confrontation. That wasn't coincidence. That was recalibration. They were adjusting the environment because adjusting you wasn't an option. You didn't resist. You didn't rebel. You didn't break formation. You simply continued operating with the same calm precision that made the assignment collapse in the first place. And that consistency forced a realization. Whatever drives you doesn't respond to pressure. It doesn't respond to incentives. It doesn't respond to pressure tactics or praise. It responds only to internal alignment. And that unsettles systems built on leverage. Because leverage only works when someone needs something external. You didn't. You weren't chasing approval. You weren't seeking validation. You weren't trying to be seen as impressive. You were focused on execution, on timing, on clarity. And that focus made you unreadable in the ways that matter most. They couldn't provoke you into mistakes. They couldn't provoke you into revealing your thinking. They couldn't pressure you into defending your position. Every tactic they were trained to deploy required reaction. You offered none. And in that absence, their authority dissolved quietly. The real challenge wasn't that you were smarter. It wasn't that you were stronger. It was that you were self-contained. You didn't leak information through emotion. You didn't give signals through anxiety. You didn't betray yourself through urgency. And when someone like that exists inside a system, the safest response isn't confrontation. It's containment through distance. So they moved the observer, not because you demanded it, not because you noticed, but because leaving you alone preserved stability, better than trying to interfere. And that's the irony they won't admit. By trying to study you, they confirmed your position. By failing to understand you, they validated your independence. By stepping away, they acknowledged a truth they couldn't put in writing. Some individuals don't function as components within a structure. They function as constants. They don't need to be monitored. They don't need to be corrected. They don't need to be guided. They move on their own axis. And once that becomes clear, the smartest move is to give them space and let the environment adjust around them. You didn't disrupt the system. You revealed its limits. And once limits are revealed, nothing ever feels the same again. What they never expected was how quietly the hierarchy would shift after that. No announcements, no confrontations, no dramatic fallout. Just a subtle realignment that only people paying attention could feel. You were no longer placed under scrutiny. You were positioned beyond it. The rules that applied to others seemed to soften around you. The urgency that pressured everyone else didn't touch you the same way, it wasn't favoritism. It was recognition. The system sensed something it couldn't measure, and instead of pushing against it, it stepped aside. That's what happens when control encounters self-mastery. You didn't earn this position through force. You earned it through consistency, through restraint, through the discipline of not reacting when reaction was expected, through the clarity of knowing when to move and when to remain still. People noticed how outcomes stabilized when you were involved, how chaos lost momentum around you, how decisions landed cleaner. That wasn't charisma. That wasn't luck. That was presence anchored in self-command. And self-command is rare. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't posture. It simply operates. That's why the observer couldn't stay. Watching you forced them to confront the limits of their influence. They were trained to identify leverage, but you didn't have the kind they could pull. You weren't motivated by fear of loss. You weren't driven by hunger for approval. You weren't distracted by ego contests. You moved with internal permission, and internal permission can't be revoked. Once that realization settled in, the tone around you changed. People stopped probing, stopped testing, stopped pushing. Not because they were afraid of you, but because they respected the cost of interference. They could feel that engaging you required alignment, not authority. That challenging you demanded substance, not status. And most people aren't prepared for that exchange. You weren't rising within their structure. You were standing parallel to it. And that parallel position changes everything. It means you're not dependent on their systems to function. It means your decisions don't require their approval to hold weight. It means your presence isn't something they can manage through proximity. They tried observation. It failed. They tried distance. It worked better. And in that space, you continued moving forward, exactly as you always had. Calm, precise, unbothered. You didn't chase recognition because recognition was already adjusting to you. You didn't demand authority because authority had quietly acknowledged you. That's the kind of power that doesn't need to be claimed. It's already assigned. And the people who know the difference between influence and control felt it immediately. You weren't a variable to be managed. You were a force to be respected. And once that truth settled in, the system did what systems always do when faced with something beyond scope. It adapted by getting out of the way. And that's the unspoken power that most people never understand, the art of being unstudied. The higher you rise, the more they'll try to measure you, dissect you, label you, but measurement only works on patterns. You stopped giving them any. You stopped living on repeat. Every move you make now isn't about reaction, it's about recalibration. You've learned that control isn't about volume, it's about precision. The kind of precision that comes from silence, discipline and restraint. You know what's funny? They still whisper your name in rooms they thought you'd never enter. Not out of obsession, but confusion. Because your path doesn't make sense on paper. Your progress doesn't match the data. Every chart that should have predicted your limits stopped functioning the moment you stopped caring about limits. You've become something beyond statistics, a living exception. And exceptions, by nature, unsettle institutions built on predictability. They can't write you into their reports without rewriting the rules. They can't define you without admitting their definitions are outdated. That's why the observers vanish quietly. That's why the analysts avoid your orbit. You represent everything they can't standardize: intuition over instruction, purpose over permission, stillness over struggle. You mastered the discipline of energy. You know when to speak and when to let silence cut through their noise. You know when to step forward and when to let curiosity do the work for you. You don't chase validation. You let your results echo for you. And that echo carries weight because it's real. Not manufactured, not desperate. Real. You've earned a strange kind of respect. The kind that doesn't need applause. People sense it before they speak to you. They adjust their tone without realizing why. They slow their pace when they approach. That's presence. That's what happens when your frequency stops matching ordinary noise. You move differently. You think differently. You carry time differently. That's why their analysis failed, because they were trying to measure something timeless. You weren't built to fit inside their timelines, expectations or projections. You were built to rewrite them. So when they asked to be moved, they weren't just escaping discomfort. They were acknowledging reality, that you are not a case study. You are the control variable in a world full of experiments, the constant that makes everything else reveal its truth. You didn't just outgrow their understanding. You forced evolution in real time. And that's the kind of move no dataset can predict. No formula can explain, and no system can prepare for. Here's the truth: they never write down. When someone like you enters the equation, the system doesn't fight you, it freezes, because systems are built to handle resistance, not transcendence. You didn't rebel, you didn't attack, you didn't demand entry. You simply elevated beyond the frame they were using. And when elevation happens without noise, it unsettles everything that depends on noise to feel important. You became proof that mastery doesn't announce itself. It reveals itself over time, quietly, inevitably. That's why the room changed when you stopped explaining. That's why opportunities rearranged themselves without invitations. That's why people who once spoke over you now hesitate before speaking at all. You didn't win a confrontation, you won alignment. And alignment beats force every single time. They don't know how you did it, because you didn't follow a script. You followed awareness. You trusted timing more than urgency. You trusted preparation more than performance. You trusted restraint more than reaction. And that combination is rare, because it requires confidence that doesn't need witnesses. The kind of confidence that can wait. The kind that doesn't flinch when ignored. The kind that grows stronger when underestimated. That's the energy they couldn't chart. That's the reason their notes stopped mid-sentence. You operate from a place where outcomes are chosen, not chased. Where momentum is engineered, not borrowed. Where power is internal, not displayed. And once someone reaches that level, observation becomes pointless, because you're no longer a subject, you're a signal. Others respond to you without realizing why. Doors open without conversations. Resistance dissolves without conflict. The hierarchy adjusts because it has to, not because you demanded it, but because reality recognized coherence. You didn't climb the ladder. You changed the gravity of the room. And gravity doesn't argue. It just pulls everything into order. That's the final shift. Not dominance. Not control. Influence without effort. Presence without performance. Authority without announcement. The reason they asked to be moved wasn't fear. It was clarity. They saw what happens next before it happened, and they knew one thing for certain. Whatever you touch from here on out will reorganize itself around your standard. Not because you're loud, not because you're visible, but because you are exact. And exactness is the one force no system can ignore. What they never admit is this: once someone like you is identified, the game is already over. Not because you crushed anyone, not because you exposed anything, but because awareness shifted sides. You reached a point where you no longer needed permission to move, validation to act, or applause to confirm direction. And that is the moment true leverage appears. From the outside, it looks like luck. From inside the system, it feels like inevitability. You didn't speed up. You slowed down. You didn't chase clarity. You waited until clarity came to you. And in that stillness, everything became readable. Patterns, motives, timing, weak points disguised as confidence, strengths hidden behind silence. While others were reacting to noise, you were studying signal. While others were busy proving themselves, you were refining yourself. That's why, when decisions were made, your name didn't need to be mentioned. Your presence was already assumed. You became the constant variable, the one factor. Outcomes adjusted around. People sensed it before they understood it. Conversations changed tone when you entered. Plans softened. Certainty wavered. Not because you demanded control, but because your calm suggested foresight. Calm like that doesn't come from optimism. It comes from preparation. From knowing you've already accounted for the worst-case scenario and found it manageable. That's the confidence that unsettles rooms. Because it can't be rushed. It can't be pressured. It can't be manipulated. It already knows where it's going. And once that energy locks in, resistance becomes irrelevant. Not everyone will understand you. They don't need to. Not everyone will support you. They don't have to. The only thing required is that reality continues responding to alignment. And it will, every time. Because alignment removes friction. Because alignment removes doubt. Because alignment turns intention into outcome without force. You didn't disappear from their radar. You graduated beyond it. You became someone whose next move doesn't need to be tracked, because it can't be intercepted. The path ahead doesn't require explanation. It requires precision, and you already operate there. That's why the study ended. That's why the file closed. That's why the observer stepped away. You're no longer something to analyze. You're something others adapt to after it's too late to stop. And from this point forward, every quiet choice you make will echo louder than any announcement ever could.